about what I'm calling the evolution of a security practitioner. Uh, this is a big year for me. It's actually my 20th college reunion, and it's actually 15 years since my first real security job. So I've been thinking a lot about how did I end up here and all of the evolution I've gone through over those years. I remember showing up to college my first year, and my roommate told me she wanted to be either a pediatric oncologist or cardiologist. And I laughed. It was just such a specific thing to say. And she knew that she wanted to take care of 6 kids for as long as she could remember. And she was right. And today she's an attending at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. But most kids are not that specific. Most kids do say things like, oh, I want to be a doctor. I want to be a nurse, scientist, teacher. Apparently now they also say YouTuber or TikToker or things like that. I found a couple different surveys on this topic. But one thing that you do consistently still hear is that kids say they want to do things like help people or work with technology. And I think that's how a lot of us ended up in security. Although almost universally, when I ask people how they end up in security, the word accidental happened. And that's definitely something I related to. But in thinking about this, really, I came up with this idea. I'll be honest, most of my talks starts with like a meme or a joke. This is like an idea that's been kicking around in my head for a while, which is just that like, as you are growing as a security practitioner, you sort of go through this evolution from being somewhat ignorant about security, then having the aha moment when you become enlightened into the wonders of how the world works. And then you're an evangelist. And like many evangelists, you maybe have fairly rigid thoughts and aren't open to people with contrasting beliefs. But I think the final evolution, the peak, the pinnacle, whatever you want to call it, is just being empathetic, is bringing empathy to your work. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today sort of about my journey through these stages and, some of the things I see in those stages and how you make sure you reach that last stage. For me, I definitely did not start out with an interest in security. I had a dad who spent a pretty significant amount of money for our family buying a computer in 1989 and made technology an integral part of my childhood. I did major in computer science, and my senior year, I ended up in a security class, not necessarily because I was like, oh, this is what I want to do, but I knew that I wanted, I had the interest and I tried it out and ended up finding a professor who would let me actually be a research assistant for him, and that would pay for my master's degree. And I didn't want to take out more loans, so that sounded like something I could be interested in. I decided I was interested in security. But then I am working on electronic voting, and things really clicked for me. This was my moment, and learning about the systems and how you could exploit them. It wasn't just counting up ballots. That was really a change for me, and I had a whole new way of looking at the world. And then joined Forsythe Software because I believed we could fix software through static analysis. We would just find all the bugs, and developers would just fix them. And I spent years trying to figure out what the magic formula was to convince developers to just follow our guidance. Finally, in 2016, I decided to try the other side and started running security programs at healthcare and wellness startups. This latest stage of my career has really been about learning how to center empathy in my work. So we'll start with stage 1, ignorant. I think this is the one that we've all been through. I definitely started thinking about, before I started thinking about security, I did all the bad things. I had terrible passwords. I mostly had one password that varied by whoever my current crush was. I am telling you this now because those passwords are all in some breach somewhere, some dump somewhere from a breach. If I was forced to, I might add my birth year, all of those things. I didn't really think about passwords in terms of security. At most, I worried about who in my life could guess those passwords. When I started coding in college, I wasn't taught secure coding. I definitely built a pseudo Amazon with sequential user IDs in the URL when I was in a database class. It didn't seem particularly important to me to think about how someone could break the system. I just was focusing on schemas and performance. But when I did start encountering security more, especially in the class I took senior year, I felt like I was seeing the world in a whole new way. I remember the exercise that I did when I was taking that class where you see visually how, when you encrypt things one way, you can actually see the patterns in the data. I remember changing all my passwords to phrases because now I understood rainbow tables. Of course, I also constantly had to reset my passwords. Mostly my own business, well, even if I was judging other people for their passwords, including my college friend who did not change her password, even after she broke up with the guy she had told it to. I just generally was like, well, I'm not going to fix her security. I also started looking at how other people were building software, and I did a security review of our undergraduate association's voting system. In retrospect, this is a great example of lack of empathy. We spent probably as long doing this review as the poor student who built it did, and we spent weeks poking through their code, looking at their website, mapping out where the server was located in pursuit of a good grade. The result was pretty scathing and had little in the way of realistic recommendations. And in particular, remember that a lot of the things I was criticizing were things that when I was building my own software months ago, I had done. But I did feel like, oh, well, I know better now. I know how to solve this. And that's what leads to the evangelist phase. I expanded my focus from security as it directly related to me and started thinking about it more holistically. I ended up using a password manager because clearly I was going to forget all my passwords otherwise, convincing my whole family, my husband, my brother, and my father all to use the same one. And then I decided I had to switch to a different one because I liked the security model better. And in the process of switching, realizing the entire time my dad had been using the password manager, he hadn't actually changed any of his passwords to be unique and random. So he was just using a password manager to manage the same terrible passwords. Similarly, at one of my employers, I rolled out a policy requiring the use of corporate managed password manager, only discovered that people weren't using it because there was an update issue. We fixed the update issue, but still people weren't using it because they had started using a browser-based one and didn't trust the original. So we blocked it. In both of these cases, I look back and I look at how I treated the users in the situation, both my own family and my coworkers, and none of it really, I didn't take the time to understand how the tools I was choosing were impacting them. And when I was building security tools, which is what I did for 10 years, mostly around static analysis, when I was doing that, I was fully bought in. When I first started working as a security researcher, I was completely sold on the ideas of identifying issues in source code. It was obvious this was the best way to do it. I think we've all heard shift left, and I think this was even before that phrase existed, but we talked a lot about the cost of fixing issues before you deploy software versus after you deploy software. I remember comparing running a scanner to the painstaking manual analysis I did when I was in college and I was looking at at voting systems. I just felt like this was the obvious thing to do. But then I spent time on site with our customers and quickly realized how many bugs there were to fix. Now the problem to solve was how to weed out what people weren't going to fix. Let's start with getting rid of false positives. Not that we ever use that terminology in static analysis. We would call them irrelevant results, but let's weed those out. We did that, and there's still too many. So now we're going to help people filter them by the impact and how hard they are for people to fix. These are not easy things to do, but we're like, we can solve this technical problem. But even when we had filtered the bugs down to what we thought was a manageable number for developers to fix, developers just didn't know how to do it. So we wrote tons of guidance tailored to the language and issue that we were addressing, and they still weren't getting fixed. And it just started to frustrate me. Toward the end of my time working in security tools, I had some moments I was not very proud of. I definitely remember seeing memes about users being vulnerabilities and relating to them. I looked at the work my team had done to put into rules to identify vulnerabilities and guidance how to fix them, and decided builders must not care about fixing them. Security was something they thought was irrelevant. I started to doubt the premise of the tools I've been building and wonder what I was missing. So I decided I would have to try to actually fix bugs myself. I made the leap to running a security program at a small healthcare startup and realized what I missed was empathy for users and builders. When I started focusing on empathy for users, I immediately realized a lot of the password advice I've been giving was one-sided. Some people like password managers, but they need help getting started. I showed my dad how to change passwords easily and focused on most critical ones. What had been happening was he did not trust the password manager to actually remember the password when he changed it. So to him, changing a password meant generating a password, copying it somewhere, then changing it, and then going and saving it in the password manager. Once he actually was using the tool as expected, it wasn't that hard. I still didn't get him to change all of them, but I was able to get him to change things like his bank password. Netflix password, still really easy to remember, but then again, I steal his Netflix account, so I'm not going to complain too much about that. Some people don't need a password manager. I have an aunt who really does use a password notebook because she rarely accesses accounts outside her home and feels more secure that way. She also lives alone and keeps the notebook someplace private, so it seems like a perfectly reasonable thing for her to do. Recognizing that users need flexibility and better options is really important. Also, fundamentally, passwords are a terrible user experience. I think the biggest thing for me was realizing that the problem was not the people, the problem was the passwords. I'm really excited to see more and more companies move beyond them to WebAuthn, social login services, and other options that give users flexibility. Tools can be empathetic too. I've been fortunate to work with amazing security engineers, and when they're able to bring empathy to the tools they provide builders, it's incredibly impactful. Another employer, we were worried about software quality issues. We looked at tools, but they just produced huge volume issues without much ability to manage them, the onslaught among our team and the product engineering team. So we started from our biggest risks, access control, logging of sensitive data. The security engineer built custom build scripts to identify potential issues. Based on his knowledge of the team's software practices, he could actually detect most of the correct code snippets and flag those that didn't fit the patterns. Then, after he had identified all of those, he blocked any addition of new code snippets that didn't fit the patterns and reviewed any ones that were checked in that did. After he built the framework for asserting any exceptions to the standard patterns, we broke up the work into teams and worked with engineering leadership to ensure the work was scoped for the next quarter. Once we did that, we ran trainings and filed tickets. Now the team had a defined set of work, time to do the work, and training on how to do it. At the end of this whole process, which we did maintain a leaderboard for across the quarter, we had actually finished all of it, and we recognized the builders for their effort and celebrated. The engineering team ended up being grateful because they did find a couple potentially critical issues, but they were able to fix them outside of an incident, and the resulting code was more readable. But mostly they appreciated the way the security work was explained and prioritized, because we were really realistic about how we talked about the risks, because we broke it up into a manageable initial investment, and then we had a low ongoing maintenance cost, and we sold all of it to leadership. It was easy for them to care. Fundamentally, you need to put yourself in their place, basic empathy. For users, it's about paying attention to their threat models, and I use the plural on purpose because users are not homogeneous and they are rarely you. Consider what their capabilities are. I don't mean that in a demeaning way. I cannot use a password notebook because I can barely be trusted to keep track of my phone, and I've never had a notebook that I didn't spill coffee on. I do not have the capability of using a password notebook, but as it turns out, I'm pretty good with technology and I'm happy to use a password manager. Provide users options and educate them on the options. Secure defaults are great, but educate users can decide on their controls. And user research is amazing. If you have access to a user research team, see if you can collaborate. If not, try to get access to any feedback users provide on security controls. And users, by the way, do include your coworkers. Another way of calling feedback is actually help desk tickets. You learn a lot from actually seeing what causes them friction. I've been using the term builders in this talk because I think it's important to remember that that's what they're trying to do. Don't try and make them choose between their core job duty, building, and security. You need to make it part of their core job. What's their best practices? What are their workflows? How can you influence the engineering roadmap? Use their tools. The more security tooling diverges from product and engineering tooling, the less likely they are to engage with it. It's totally fine if our tools are very independent for things that are internal to the security team, but we better integrate them back into the engineering tools when it's time for them to do work. Explain the impact and risk honestly, and give them the ability to accept some risk. You will not always agree with their choices, but if you accept that with low risk items, they get some control, it'll be easier to prioritize higher risk items. This is one of my biggest learnings from when I've run vulnerability management programs. I don't even try to get certain risks addressed. I just put them into the backlog. But when I come to an engineering team with a high risk item, it will get fixed. Finally, recognition and praise. This is where my parenting background really comes into play. Even if it's part of their job, even if it's a basic expectation of life, when the builders invest in security, they are often stepping outside their comfort zone and even using a bit of empathy for you. So recognize and reward it. I think the biggest one that we might need a little bit more of in security is empathy for your team. Cybersecurity burnout is a real issue. There are a bunch of articles out there claiming over half of us are burnt out. And I'm not going to say that doesn't align with my experience. And certainly some of the reason is overwork. There's not enough of us and there's plenty of work to go around. But that's pretty common across technology. I think it's especially important to consider the security-specific reasons why burnout is so prevalent. One of the biggest ones is the feeling of being in opposition to your coworkers and that they just don't understand the priority of security work, or even in opposition to your users sometimes. I try hard to take the time to listen as a peer and as a leader and understand what the source of individual frustrations are. Sometimes the first thing you need to do is just let people rant a little bit and empathize with what they're going through. But one of the biggest ones is to bring everyone back to being realistic about risk. It can be really hard when you're trying to explain to things why they should care, not to exaggerate. When it feels like no one's listening to you, that's when we discover FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and disaster that we all hate in our industry. Instead, talk about what realistic amount of risk you're dealing with. Think about the incentives of other teams and help your peers and help your coworkers do the same. Do the builders not want to fix something or are they struggling because their project is already behind schedule? Would they be more receptive to this project if it chipped away at some of their tech debt in some way? Would it make it easier to do a project plan for next quarter? Could we implement a tool and eliminate a manual process? All of these are the kinds of questions you want to bring to your coworkers when they're really frustrated about their interactions with other teams. Finally, stop and ask yourself and your coworker, what if we don't fix this? Is this going to be an incident in the future? Or is this really part of a prototype so it's legitimately low risk, even if we might have to rebuild it for production, and it seems silly? It might be really frustrating to lose, and that's the way it feels sometimes, but that might be the right thing to do. Making sure that other people understand why the choice was made and have the opportunity to be heard might be the biggest thing you can do. One of my biggest revelations was extending my empathy beyond the parties I relate most closely to. I've been a vendor, so this was actually the easiest. A lot of vendors build products that frustrate me and don't do what they're supposed to. So I invest in telling them what I want. And if I don't buy, I make it clear why. I've even had security people at vendors backchannel me thanks for advocating for features they've been pushing internally. Sales was a bit harder for me. I think many of us have been burned by sales saying things that we could not back up. One issue that's come up with me is commitments to complete assessments on unreasonable timelines. I took a step back and I thought about how are salespeople incentivized? Oh, they get compensated based on the deal size and they have quarterly deadlines. So I really tie my deadlines to them, to those quarterly deadlines. So they understand if they are trying to make a sale, here's when I need the questions that they have for me so that I can deliver on time. I also will prioritize fairly ruthlessly based on deal size because that is how they prioritize things too. I make commitments to what I can do and then I try really hard to live up to them. And I hope that they can understand when I cannot deliver on their last minute requests. Finally, when I get to an executive team and ask to purchase a tool or hire an engineer, have I made sure they understand how security programs actually tie to our overall revenue? I point out places where a missing control caused a longer assessment, meaning we took an extra month to sell to this company because we had to do such a detailed assessment for them because we just didn't have some basic controls in place. Or did we actually not even get the deal? Did we have a near miss incident that would have impacted our biggest customer with this amount of revenue because we didn't have this control in place, these are the things I'm bringing to them when I'm asking for money. Above all, I accept my priorities are not their priorities. That doesn't mean I'll accept the risk, but some risk is inevitable, and I have to make sure I'm doing my job and communicating. Don't get stuck at the evangelist stage. This is my biggest lesson to people. I've seen people do this. This will burn you out and it will burn down your security program. You'll be burnt out because you see everything as a failure. You didn't get the engineering team to re-implement the authentication system to change the user model when you pointed out a risk. So you failed. In actuality, my team was able to do that over the course of 18 months and not only address major risks, but it opened up the engineering team to build future features. It took a year of tracking related issues, both security and feature blocking, revising design documents, and eventually co-opting a talented new engineer who just happened to get assigned a security engineer as an onboarding buddy. But we did actually fix that issue. You will be burnt out because your coworkers hide things from you for fear of being slowed down because you are great at pointing out issues, but not great at finding solutions. Versus builders checking in with you because they're worried about a new feature and want to have a conversation early on in the process to make sure they plan appropriately. The end result wasn't exactly what you would have wanted, but it was delivered on time, and there are improvements on the roadmap. I was working with a VP of engineering at one point that in our first meeting was genuinely shocked by my collaborative approach. I felt sad. I realized he had been bracing to meet me because he thought I had a litany of complaints. I did not come with a list of issues. I did come with a list of issues that I was concerned about, but also with how I was already working on them with his team and how I would prioritize and communicate new issues in the future. I genuinely wanted to ask him, what security person hurt you? Lastly, be empathetic to yourself. It's really hard. I had an early mentor tell me I couldn't take home all the burden. I could only accept as much risk as I was empowered to manage. And sometimes that means making someone else uncomfortable. I've been the person in the meeting saying what someone else wants to do is illegal or unethical. I've also been the person who accepted a risk that later turned into an incident, and it was not something I wanted to have happen. At the end of the day, I try and learn from my failures and apply the same empathy I have for everyone else to myself. So why am I still working in security with that ringing endorsement? Interesting problems. Right now, I'm actually really interested in AI's impact on security. I initially was very dismissive, but I think in the past 6 months, I've come around to some of the ways it actually can be super helpful. And more importantly, I've come around to some of the ways it's incredibly terrifying. I'm loving some of the attacks recently that feel like social engineering on computers, which is just one of those things that's really fun to think about. I also think that how privacy and security intersect is a really interesting space to be in right now. I initially thought of privacy more as being something legal, but what we're finding more and more these days is that you really have to have a very technical bent to this, and that ends up often sitting in or next to the security team. And that is one of the areas that I love to talk about and learn about. Bringing my experiences to the field is something that I find rewarding and valuable. Sometimes it's important to have a woman or a mom or an older millennial, which seems to be a more rare commodity these days, in the room. I had some great experiences, especially when I was working at a pharmacy, because I was working with a bunch of young 20-somethings, and I was one of the only people who was actually actively caring for other people as a mom. And so having that voice of what it looks like for me trying to care for my children was something that was a really important part of the conversation. And being able to speak from a security perspective as well, that was something unique. And I felt like I was really contributing. Lastly, because I live in San Francisco and life is expensive, if you all know a way that I could turn my hobbies involving reading and cooking into something quite so lucrative, maybe I'll reconsider. But for now, this seems like the best way for me to continue to support my lifestyle without, having to build an entirely new career. But seriously, I think the biggest thing for me about security was I found a community. I had a really rough time early on in my career, And I had a coworker who I was working remotely then, and we didn't have a lot of tools for it. So she actually scheduled a 15-minute check-in with me every single workday because she knew I was struggling. She knew that I had lots of questions and I wasn't doing a great job of reaching out. So she just put 15 minutes on my calendar every day. And so that was something that made a huge impact on my ability to move forward when I switched into security and initially was fairly underwater. I also had a boss that told me I could run a team and talked me through that transition, and then through the transition back to an individual contributor when I got overwhelmed after my kids were born. Having the same person recognize my abilities in both those areas and push me to keep doing what I liked was really important. I have a peer that does not show up to events that do not have diverse speaker lists or attendee lists. As he has gotten more and more senior in his career, this is something that he's prioritized. And the fact that all of these people had the empathy to see me and support me, incredibly important to me in my career. Also, Day of Security. This is a great example of how empathy plays a role in our community. And it's not just a Day of Security. There are tons of great events that are run largely through volunteers, through people who are passionate about sharing their love of security. And I really hope that over the course of this conference, both today and tomorrow, hopefully for those of you who are fortunate enough to go in person, you get to experience that community and the empathy that all of them bring to their work. That is it for me.
That was wonderful, Joy.
That was terrific.
It
Wow.
was fantastic. I really love what you were so vulnerable with in that. Yeah, it's interesting, it's challenging, it's frustrating, and we have to make money, all of us. So I
Yeah.
loved it. Joy rocked it. What a day, Brenly. It's already ending. I know we have tomorrow, but it's over.
I'm
Almost.
so fast. And, you know, a huge thank you to all of the speakers, to our sponsors, and to our attendees. I mean, this was really a great, great day.
Yes, I mean, let's not forget that free knowledge doesn't really exist, and that's what Day of Security is doing. And it's not free since our sponsors pay, but it's free to attend, and we love that, and we expect to keep it that way. So those of you that are coming tomorrow to the Reddit's office, we'll see you in person. Those of you that can't make it, we hope to see you either May, India, which is in-country speakers, but we all can participate digitally. And then November is Day of Security, digital and in person in Boston. We will continue to give the stage at free admission and continue to help everybody build community. So we hope you got a ton out of today, right, Brenly?
That's right. And don't forget, we have a Slack channel that because you're registered, you can continue to network, chat with colleagues that you have not met before. There's channels for being a mentor, a mentoree. There are also job opportunity channels, as well as just chatting, networking, which is great. And we'd love to see you active on there.
Yes, and tomorrow is also digital. So all the in-person is live streaming. So continue to keep us on and cheering each other. Congratulations to everybody who spoke today and made it through all the challenges that can come with that, with just even anxiety and stress. And just know that overcoming that builds us all for real incidents that we need to be ready for. And the friendships, and if you haven't reached out to people, do so after, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow and in the future.
Yeah, and a special shout out to Kelly, our phenomenal program leader who has really run all of our Day of Security so effectively, and to all of our volunteers. Thank you so much. And as Deidre mentioned, we look forward to seeing you either in person or virtually tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.